What if the value of your money has never been determined by markets, supply, or productivity, but by a set of invisible rules created long before you were born? What if the rise and fall of currencies, the strength of your savings, and the purchasing power you think you control are all shaped by decisions made in private rooms, by people whose names never appear on the evening news? This question is uncomfortable because it challenges the foundation most people depend on. We are taught that money follows logic, that value is objective, that prices reflect reality. But history shows something different. Every major financial system has been guided by hidden mechanisms designed to favor those who built them. And once these rules are in place, entire nations live inside them without even realizing it. From the moment modern economies emerged, power was concentrated in groups who understood one truth. Money is not valuable because it is scarce. It is valuable because someone powerful declares it so. And those declarations are never neutral. They shape governments, markets, wages, and crises. They influence who rises, who falls, and who stays trapped in a cycle they never chose. When you look closely, you start to see that currency strength, interest rates, and national debt are not random outcomes. They are engineered environments. They are tools. They are levers used to guide behavior, reward compliance, and extract value through systems that appear fair on the surface but are deeply controlled underneath. You have felt this influence even if you never noticed it. When inflation erodes your savings, when credit becomes expensive overnight, when assets rise for a few and collapse for many, none of that is accidental. These shifts follow patterns that benefit those who already sit above the system, not those living inside it. And once you recognize this pattern, once you see that the financial world operates on rules invisible to the public, a disturbing realization emerges. You have been participating in a game whose creators never intended for you to win. The question is not whether these rules exist. It is who built them, why they persist, and how deeply they shape the value of everything you earn. And before we move forward, tell me something. Have you ever felt that the financial world reacts in ways that make no sense, as if someone else was pulling the strings while you are left guessing in the dark? If this opening made you question how much control you truly have over your money, leave a comment sharing your experience, hit the like button, and check if you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss what comes next, because what you are about to discover will change the way you see the system forever as we continue deeper into the hidden architecture behind the value of money. Once you begin to question who truly defines the value of money, you inevitably arrive at the groups that shaped public perception long before ordinary people understood what currency even was. These early architects did not just influence economic behavior. They engineered a belief system. They needed societies to accept the idea that money was stable, trustworthy, inevitable. And to achieve that, they crafted narratives that disguised control as natural order. Over generations, these narratives became so deeply embedded that people stopped asking who benefits from them. They simply accepted the financial world as something that functions on its own, independent of intentions or selective advantages. But the truth is that the financial elite studied psychology long before the field existed as a science. They understood how fear, trust, and authority shape human behavior. They knew that if people believed money was safe, they would behave predictably. They would save in the currencies designed for them, borrow through the institutions approved for them, and value wealth by the standards taught to them. This psychological framework became the backbone of modern finance. It is the reason nations defend their currencies with patriotic language. It is why people tie their sense of security to their savings. It is why inflation feels like a threat, debt feels like a burden, and credit feels like an opportunity, even when each of those reactions is designed to guide behavior rather than reflect objective truth. The elite did not need to control every transaction. They only needed to control the story about what money means, and so, they built an ecosystem where perception shapes value as much as economics does. A currency backed by confidence can outperform a currency backed by production. A market fueled by optimism can rise even when fundamentals are weak. A society that believes in the strength of its monetary system will defend that system, even when it works against them. This is not accidental. It is engineered through institutions that speak with authority, through experts who repeat, The same frameworks, through policies presented as science rather than strategy. Once this system was in place, it became self-reinforcing. The public trusted the institutions because they sounded credible. The institutions sounded credible because they controlled the language of finance. And through this loop, the elite maintained quiet influence over the emotional core of economic life. They taught people to trust the stability of paper, the fairness of markets, and the neutrality of interest rates. But behind each of these beliefs lies a carefully constructed narrative designed to keep societies aligned with the invisible rules that serve those who wrote them. And once this psychological foundation was established, the next step was to create the structures that would give these narratives real power, shaping how money is created, controlled, and valued across entire nations. As the psychological groundwork took hold, the next step was the creation of the tangible structures that would turn belief into power. These institutions did not emerge organically or through democratic consensus. They were deliberately shaped by individuals who understood that the authority to issue money is the authority to define reality. Central institutions became the guardians of monetary order, but they were built on foundations designed to concentrate influence rather than distribute it. From the moment they were established, their purpose was not simply to manage economies, but to anchor the invisible rules that govern them. These structures were presented to the public as neutral, scientific, and necessary. People were told that modern economies required centralized oversight to maintain stability. They were assured that interest rates, currency supply, and liquidity were too complex for ordinary citizens or elected officials to handle. By embedding the appearance of expertise into their identity, these institutions created a protective shield. Anyone who questioned them appeared uninformed. Anyone who challenged them seemed reckless. The strategy was brilliant because it shaped not only policy, but culture. Financial authority became a matter of trust rather than transparency. Behind closed doors, the mechanisms were far simpler than the public was led to believe. Money creation was controlled through a system that allowed small groups to determine how much currency entered the economy, what it cost to borrow, and how quickly it could expand or contract. These decisions shaped everything from home prices to national debt to the strength of entire industries. Yet the public rarely saw the process. They only experienced its effects. Rising costs, shifting markets, sudden booms followed by sudden busts. The system reinforced the illusion that these outcomes were natural cycles rather than the deliberate consequences of design. And the designers made sure that the architecture protected itself. Boards were structured in a way that ensured insiders could influence outcomes for decades. Oversight was fragmented, public accountability minimal, and the complexity of the system made it nearly impossible for ordinary citizens to understand where power truly resided. This opacity served a purpose. The less people understood, the more they relied on the very institutions that shaped the uncertainty they feared. Through these mechanisms, the rules of money became self-replicating. Once established, they could persist for generations with only minor adjustments. Political administrations changed, global alliances shifted, and economic theories rose and fell, but the underlying architecture remained intact. The institutions that control money became the unseen pillars of modern life, quietly guiding decisions, behaviors, and expectations across entire societies. And as this structure solidified, the stage was set for its first major test. The deliberate manipulations that would reveal how powerful these invisible rules truly were once they began shaping global financial dependence. Once the foundational institutions were in place, the system entered a new phase, one defined not by theory, but by deliberate financial manipulation. This was the moment when the invisible rules began shaping outcomes on a global scale. The earliest orchestrated interventions did not look like the dramatic events we associate with modern crises. They appeared subtle, technical, almost administrative. But beneath the surface, they established the recurring patterns of dependence that still define our financial world. These manipulations were not created to respond to emergencies. They created the emergencies themselves, ensuring that the architects of the system always remained indispensable. The first experiments revolved around controlling liquidity in ways the public could not detect. Shifts in money supply were presented as strategic adjustments, even when they destabilized entire markets. When credit expanded, economies surged, giving the illusion of prosperity. When it contracted suddenly, industries collapsed, prices fell, and governments panicked. Each wave built a deeper reliance on the institutions that controlled the flow of money. It was a cycle that rewarded concentration of power, while convincing society that the turbulence was merely the cost of modern progress. As these cycles repeated, financial institutions discovered something even more powerful. Crises could reset expectations. They could erase resistance. They could make the impossible suddenly acceptable. During periods of stability, people questioned authority. But when markets fell apart, when currencies weakened, when unemployment surged, the same institutions that caused the instability were welcomed back as saviors. This pattern became the blueprint: create volatility, then step in as the only force capable of restoring order. And each time the cycle repeated, the rules tightened further. Governments, too, fell into this rhythm. Rather than resisting manipulation, they adapted to it. Their survival depended on maintaining public confidence, and the institutions that orchestrated monetary conditions became essential to that stability. Policies that once seemed unthinkable became common practice. Bailouts, emergency interventions, engineered interest rate shifts, and coordinated market actions were all normalized. The public saw them as responses. In reality, they were extensions of the invisible design. These early manipulations did more than steer economies. They trained entire nations to accept a financial environment where cause and effect were blurred, where the people who shaped the system could never be held accountable because the mechanisms were too complex, too hidden, too insulated for ordinary scrutiny. It was in this stage that dependence transformed into expectation, and expectation into obedience. And as societies adapted to this new normal, the groundwork was laid for the next evolution of control, where the institutions behind the rules would rise from influential to untouchable. If this perspective resonates with you or reminds you of shifts you have witnessed in your own lifetime, share your thoughts in the comments and tell me what part of this system you believe most people still overlook as we move deeper into the hidden architecture shaping modern money. As financial manipulation evolved into a predictable cycle, the institutions behind it began consolidating their authority in a way that transformed them from influential actors into structural pillars. This stage marked the moment when the system stopped relying on covert influence and instead embedded itself into the legal, political, and economic frameworks of entire nations. What had begun as strategic intervention now became the architecture of stability itself. Governments, markets, and citizens were no longer simply responding to institutional decisions. They were functioning inside a reality, defined by them. This consolidation was subtle at first. Institutions gained expanded mandates in the name of protecting the economy from volatility they themselves had created. They became the arbiters of interest rates, liquidity, credit conditions, and market expectations. Their models defined what was considered responsible policy. Their language became the language of economic truth. Even elected officials, who were supposed to represent democratic authority, deferred to these institutions, because opposing them meant confronting both public fear and market instability. The result was predictable. Political leaders became caretakers, while financial authorities became architects. As the structures grew more powerful, they also grew more insulated. Layers of technical language separated the public from understanding what was happening. Complex terms like quantitative easing, forward guidance, balance sheet expansion, and liquidity injection served a dual purpose. They described financial mechanisms, but they also discouraged scrutiny. Ordinary people could not challenge what they could not decode. And since these institutions spoke with the authority of expertise, their decisions appeared not as choices, but as necessities, even when those choices benefited a narrow elite at the top of the financial hierarchy. During this period, one of the most profound shifts occurred. The alignment between governments and central institutions became nearly complete. Political cycles came and went, but the financial framework remained untouched. Any effort to challenge it risked destabilizing markets, weakening currencies, or triggering crises. This dynamic ensured that the system operated above politics, beyond public pressure, and outside democratic debate. It became self-reinforcing. The institutions were too important to fail. too powerful to oppose, and too embedded to dismantle. This consolidation also reshaped the relationship between states and their citizens. Economic stability became the justification for every intervention, every adjustment, every new layer of authority. The public learned to associate monetary guardianship with safety, even though that safety depended on mechanisms that deepened long-term dependence. As long as the system delivered short-term stability, its long-term structure went unquestioned. And in that silence, these institutions expanded into something far larger than mere financial overseers. They became custodians of national destiny, quietly dictating the conditions under which individuals, companies, and governments could thrive. By the time this consolidation reached maturity, the invisible rules were no longer just influential forces. They had become the unseen skeleton of modern economic life, defining what was possible, what was permissible, and what would inevitably fail. And with this foundation solidified, the stage was set for something even more profound: the emergence of instruments so subtle and so pervasive that they would shape not only the economy, but the daily behavior of entire populations. As institutional consolidation gained strength, governments gradually shifted from being independent actors to becoming components inside a pre-engineered financial machine. This transition did not happen through confrontation, but through quiet adaptation. Governments realized that their survival, credibility, and economic performance depended on aligning with the rules established by the very institutions meant to serve them. Over time, these institutions stopped merely influencing policy and started determining the boundaries of what governments could do, creating a dynamic where political authority appeared powerful on the surface but operated within strict financial constraints enforced from above. It became increasingly clear that central institutions were not responding to governments. Governments were responding to them. National budgets had to be structured around expectations set by financial markets. Public programs had to be designed within limits defined by interest rate conditions. Debt issuance, fiscal expansion, and even emergency measures required approval not through democratic processes, but through the reaction of bond markets, credit agencies, and central banking signals. Politicians spoke the language of sovereignty, yet every major decision was shaped by an invisible financial perimeter that dictated what was viable and what would be punished through market backlash. This new reality transformed crises into mechanisms of reinforcement. Whenever governments attempted to act outside the boundaries, markets responded. Currency weakness, rising yields, capital flight, and liquidity pressure acted as immediate corrective forces. These reactions appeared spontaneous and organic, but they followed predictable patterns shaped by institutions that had already positioned themselves as guardians of stability. Governments that resisted these pressures learned quickly that stability could evaporate overnight. Those that complied were rewarded with smoother markets, favorable credit conditions, and access to capital. Compliance became the path of least resistance. As this relationship deepened, the distinction between public and private authority blurred. Central institutions operated independently, but with power that exceeded that of elected officials. Their decisions affected employment, investment, wages, inflation, and national debt. Yet they remained insulated from electoral accountability. This structure allowed them to enforce long-term strategies, even when those strategies conflicted with public interest or political promises. What appeared as neutral economic management was, in practice, an elaborate system ensuring that governments remained aligned with the invisible rules rather than with public demands. The most striking shift occurred in how societies interpreted this new order. People began to see economic outcomes not as the result of policy decisions, but as natural forces, as inevitable movements of global finance beyond human control. This perception served the system perfectly. When citizens believed economic conditions were unchangeable, they stopped questioning who truly shaped them. Governments reinforced this belief by pointing to markets as the justification for their own limitations, creating a feedback loop that elevated financial institutions into untouchable arbiters of national destiny. By the time this transformation was complete, the system had evolved into something far more sophisticated than centralized authority. It had become a global network where governments, willingly or not, acted as agents sustaining an architecture they no longer controlled. And within this framework emerged a new generation of instruments designed not just to direct economies, but to influence the daily financial behavior of entire populations, deepening submission to a system that had now become so pervasive it no longer needed to show its hand. As the financial architecture matured, the system introduced instruments so subtle yet so powerful that they redefined how individuals interacted with money itself. These mechanisms did not merely shape economies, they shaped behavior. They determined how people saved, borrowed, invested, spent, and planned their futures. Unlike earlier tools, which operated at the national or institutional level, these instruments worked directly on the psychology of the population. They guided financial decisions not through force, but through engineered incentives that made submission feel voluntary, rational, even responsible. Inflation became one of the most effective of these invisible instruments. Presented as a natural consequence of economic growth, it quietly redistributed wealth from savers to debt holders, eroding purchasing power slowly enough that most people did not recognize the pattern. Year after year, what people earned bought less. Their savings lost value, their sense of security weakened, and in response, they were encouraged to take on more financial risk, chase returns, or participate in asset markets they did not understand. Inflation, framed as a neutral force, was in reality a behavioral lever, steering entire populations away from independence and toward greater systemic dependence. Debt followed the same logic. Rather than being seen as a burden, it was rebranded as opportunity. Mortgages became symbols of stability, student loans a prerequisite for advancement, and consumer credit a marker of participation in modern life. Each of these products tied individuals directly to the system, transforming financial institutions from distant authorities into daily companions. The brilliance of this arrangement was that it appeared empowering. People believed they were choosing upward mobility, when in reality, they were entering long-term contracts that bound their expectations, spending habits, and life decisions to rules they did not write. Interest rates, another invisible instrument, shaped the tempo of entire societies. Lower rates encouraged risk-taking, expansion, and speculation. Higher rates enforced restraint, contraction, and discipline. But these cycles were not expressions of natural economic forces. They were coordinated signals that controlled the pace of economic activity, training populations to adapt their behavior according to institutional priorities. Over time, people became conditioned to interpret these signals as guidance, adjusting their financial lives around decisions made in conference rooms they would never see. What made these instruments truly powerful was their ability to operate beneath awareness. They shaped desires without appearing coercive, created urgency without appearing manipulative, and controlled outcomes while maintaining the illusion of personal choice. By influencing the basic mechanics of survival and aspiration, they ensured that the invisible rules governing money became embedded in the daily decisions of millions. And once these tools were fully integrated into the fabric of society, the system no longer needed to assert authority openly. Its influence lived inside the minds and habits of the people themselves. If any part of this feels familiar to you or reflects patterns you have observed in your own financial life, leave a comment sharing what stood out most as we continue deeper into how these invisible mechanisms shape everything around us. As these instruments quietly reshaped economic behavior, a deeper transformation took place beneath the surface, one that extended far beyond markets or institutions. The invisible rules governing money began influencing not just what people could afford, but how they interpreted their own lives. A new psychological landscape emerged, built on expectations engineered by decades of subtle manipulation. Individuals stopped seeing money as a neutral tool and began experiencing it as an ever-shifting force that dictated their choices, their ambitions, and even their sense of security. This was not accidental. It was the outcome of a system designed to shape thought as much as it shaped economic outcomes. At the heart of this transformation was a carefully cultivated sense of uncertainty. When inflation eroded savings, when interest rates swung without warning, when asset prices rose and collapsed in unpredictable cycles, people began living in a constant state of financial vigilance. Every decision carried more weight. Every mistake felt irreversible. And in that uncertainty, the system gained tremendous leverage. People who feel financially unstable become more compliant, more dependent, more willing to accept structures that claim to offer protection. The invisible rules no longer needed to persuade. They simply needed to maintain a landscape where stability felt perpetually out of reach. This psychological conditioning extended into expectations about success and failure. As wealth concentrated at the top, individuals were taught to internalize responsibility for outcomes that were structurally predetermined. If they struggled to save, it was framed as poor discipline. If they fell behind, it was framed as a personal shortcoming. Yet the system ensured that upward mobility became increasingly difficult, and economic pressure increasingly normalized. By reframing structural limitations as individual failures, the invisible rules protected themselves from scrutiny. People looked inward for answers instead of questioning the environment designed to restrict their progress. Over time, this conditioning reshaped identity and aspiration. Financial goals shifted from stability to survival. The dream of long-term security faded into short-term coping. Families adjusted expectations, postponing milestones once considered basic components of adult life. Buying homes, raising children, building savings, retiring comfortably, these became ambitions reserved for the few. For everyone else, the system offered endless substitutes: credit, subscription models, temporary comforts, and digital illusions of ownership. These substitutes kept people engaged in a cycle that never resolved, always promising progress while delivering dependence. What made this psychological shift truly profound was its invisibility. People adapted because adaptation felt rational. They accepted instability because it felt universal. They believed their concerns were personal when, in fact, they were symptoms of a large-scale financial environment intentionally shaped to produce those exact feelings. The invisible rules became invisible not because they were hidden, but because they were normalized. They shaped thought, emotion, and behavior with such efficiency that questioning them felt unnatural. By the time this psychological foundation was fully in place, the system no longer needed to enforce its rules through institutions alone. The rules lived inside the population, influencing decision-making without revealing their origins. And with this transformation complete, the stage was set for one of the most powerful dynamics of all: the strategic use of economic crises to reinforce the architecture and extend its reach even further. As the psychological environment solidified, crises became not anomalies but essential mechanisms within the system. What appeared, to the public, as sudden shocks were often predictable outcomes of structural design, events that served to recalibrate expectations and reinforce the authority of the invisible rules. Each crisis, whether financial, monetary, or geopolitical, functioned as a strategic reset that strengthened the architecture rather than jeopardizing it. The system had evolved to turn disruption into opportunity, instability into justification, and widespread fear into renewed dependence. The power of crises lies in their ability to overwhelm individual agency. When markets crash, when savings evaporate, when jobs disappear, people no longer question the origins of the instability. They focus solely on survival. In that moment, the institutions behind the rules become indispensable, stepping forward with solutions that further entrench their influence. Emergency lending programs, coordinated interventions, liquidity injections, and sweeping policy changes are introduced as temporary measures, even though many of them become permanent features of the financial landscape. The system expands under the guise of protecting society from dangers it helped create. Crises also serve to redraw the boundaries of what is politically possible. Policies previously dismissed as unacceptable become inevitable when fear is widespread. Debt ceilings rise, regulatory frameworks shift, and central authorities gain new powers. These transformations unfold quietly because the public is preoccupied with immediate consequences. In the aftermath, people return to their routines, unaware that the system has tightened its grip. The invisible rules rely on this pattern because it ensures that every crisis results in fewer challengers and more structural consolidation. Another crucial function of crises is the redistribution of wealth and influence. During downturns, assets are transferred from the vulnerable to the powerful at unprecedented speed. Falling prices create opportunities for those with liquidity, while those without it lose homes, savings, and stability. Entire industries can be reshaped or absorbed by larger entities under the narrative of rescue. These cycles repeat with mechanical precision, reinforcing hierarchies that remain hidden beneath the language of recovery and stabilization. Each crisis becomes a reminder that the rules do not operate symmetrically. They are designed to protect certain participants more than others. Most importantly, crises reshape collective memory. They create narratives that justify the system by depicting alternatives as dangerous or chaotic. The public learns to associate institutional authority with safety, even when that authority played a direct role in generating the instability. Over time, people forget the details of how the crisis began. What remains is the emotional imprint, fear of collapse, and gratitude for rescue. This emotional residue strengthens the system, making future crises easier to manage and their outcomes more predictable. By the time societies emerge from these recurring upheavals, the invisible rules are not weakened, they are fortified. What began as a set of mechanisms designed to influence markets has become a psychological and structural framework capable of shaping entire civilizations. And with this pattern deeply entrenched, only one piece remains: understanding how these rules define the future of money itself and what it means to live inside a system where value, stability, and freedom are guided by forces most people never see. As these invisible rules shaped every layer of the financial world, a final truth emerged. The future of money is not unfolding naturally. It is being engineered with the same deliberate precision that guided its past. The systems that once managed currency and stabilized markets are now redefining what money is, how it moves, and who ultimately controls it. Digital frameworks, centralized oversight, and algorithmic decision-making are not innovations. Born from technological progress, they are extensions of the same architecture that has governed value for centuries. The shift may feel new, but the logic behind it has remained unchanged. At the center of this transformation is the desire for predictability. The more transparent people become through digital transactions, the easier it is for institutions to guide financial behavior. Patterns can be tracked in real time. Spending habits can be influenced through subtle incentives. Entire populations can be nudged toward outcomes that align with broader systemic goals. The system is evolving into something that no longer merely reacts to human behavior, but anticipates it, shapes it, and eventually integrates it into a unified financial ecosystem where deviation becomes increasingly difficult. This new phase extends the reach of the invisible rules beyond traditional economics. Money is becoming intertwined with identity, mobility, and access. As digital financial systems expand, the boundaries between personal choice and systemic expectation blur even further. Credit scoring models influence where people can live. Transaction histories determine who receives opportunities. Algorithmic risk assessments shape which businesses survive. The architecture is becoming total, connecting every aspect of life to financial mechanisms that reward conformity and penalize unpredictability. Yet what remains most striking is the illusion of empowerment that accompanies this shift. Digital convenience is presented as liberation, the promise of faster payments, easier access, and streamlined experiences. But beneath the surface, these conveniences tighten the system. They create dependencies that are difficult to escape, replacing physical autonomy with digital oversight. The more integrated the individual becomes, the more predictable they are, and the more seamlessly the invisible rules can guide their behavior without ever revealing the hand that moves them. And this is where the system shows its final shape. The future of money is not simply about technology, it is about control. Control over movement, over choices, over the definition of value itself. A world where money becomes programmable is a world where freedom becomes conditional. And as these conditions expand, people will face a critical question. Are they participating in a financial system or living inside one? If you reach this point, your understanding of the system is already deeper than most. And if this journey opened your eyes or shifted your perspective, consider subscribing so you can stay connected to the kind of content that brings these hidden structures into focus. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I am seeing the pattern," to mark that you made it to the end, and to share your thoughts on how these invisible rules shape your own financial life. And if this discussion resonated with you, add a like to help this message reach more people who need to hear it. There is a video right here on the side that expands on this subject in a way that completes what you learned today. So click it, and continue the journey with me as we go even deeper into the forces that shape the world around us.